Hello and welcome back to the KBA Devlog series. In the last episode of this series, I went over most of the things I have implemented so far in the game, and flaunted my lack of experience. But, now that I have exhausted those topics, I decided to change the format a bit. From now on, each episode will have themes, and be much shorter, like my attention span. This episode's theme is dialogue and interaction. Before implementing these mechanics, I came up with some plans. For dialogue, I wanted it to contain a name and the dialogue the characters are speaking. For the interaction system, I wanted the player to get a visual prompt when interacting with something or someone. Let's begin by introducing you to my dialogue code, by attempting to make it as understandable and as concise as possible. First, I had to edit the properties of the dialogue scripts components section in the inspector, by creating a mini class inside the scripts class, and initializing it as an array, which is basically a list, and is represented by these square brackets. I'll also initialize some true-false checks, a float for text speed, an integer for indexing, and a reference to my text box. Next, in the start method, I clear the text box of any text left behind during testing, and move on to the start conversation method. From here, I check for the existence of the text box, and if it does exist, I activate the text box. I set the index to 0, and I set as started to true. Down here, I create a writeLine method that inserts the name entered on the corresponding dialogue index. Then, I add a for each loop to iterate through the letters in the dialogue. Based on its text speed. I also create a next line method that checks if the dialogue is complete. And if it is, it then determines if there are more dialogues in the array. If there are, it adds one to index and writes the next line of dialogue. But, if there aren't, it closes the dialogue box. Now, to get it to work in-game, I add button inputs based on if is close is true. Then, it determines if you started the conversation. If you didn't, it starts it. But if you did, it activates the next line method. Finally, I create an onTriggerEnter2D method, which is used to figure out if a certain object enters a predetermined area. In this case, the certain object being the player, and the area being the dialogue zone. Once it concludes this, I tell it to set as close to true. Or, if is trigger is true, I tell it to automatically start the conversation. Last, I use onTriggerExit2D, and tell it to reset as close, and is started to false, and then I close the text box. After slapping together some text box animations, I replace the improper parts of the script, with the same animation method I used in my last devlog. Then, at the last second, because I forgot, I cached a reference to my objects in the start method, so the script can control the animations and text in every scene. Now, let's see what John's been up to. Oh, there he is. Getting supplies? From the local mart? Well, someone got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. Okay. Well, anyway. Now that that's out of the way. The purpose of me coding the dialogue the way I did, was meant to make setting up the dialogue to be more easily customizable and personalized. It lets you add as many dialogues as you want in any given conversation, and name the speaker accordingly. It can also be set to be triggered, with or without button presses. If I decide to upgrade it later, I will include it later in this series, but until then, this works fine. Speaking about interaction, if you like what you've seen so far, interact with that like button below. Anyway, this mechanic was one of the simplest mechanics to code, with no pre-planning needed. First, I created an onTriggerEnter2D method that activates a certain bubble indicator, depending on what tag I set. Then I lazily copy-paste that code below, and replace enter with exit. As you can see now, John can now show you what you're interacting with. Whether it be an interactable object, an NPC, an enemy in your battle zone, if he's angry, an item you can eat, and an item you can drink. Some of these bubbles could also be reused in later cutscenes. That's about it for this episode. So please subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and if there is anyone who has any criticisms, preferably constructive criticisms, positive or negative, about the new format, video quality, or just the game in general, reply to the pinned comment below. See you later.